I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Hello horror hounds, welcome to my horror house. We're looking at the vampire movies of Hammer Studios, and we've reached 1970 and Taste the Blood of Dracula, a film you could also call Dracula Counts. Hammer's Dracula series has never been shy of a great title, but sometimes they are missing a great film to go with them, and I'm not entirely sure which this is. Taste picks up right where Dracula has risen from the grave, the previous movie left off, and I love me some continuity between installments of a film franchise. Here, travelling salesman Roy Kinnear is making his way through Hammer's Germanic Dracula country when he witnesses the Count's gory demise on the end of a golden cross from the end of the previous film. Ever want to spot an opportunity for profit, he makes off with the Count's ring, his cloak clasp, and the powdered blood, Dracula's blood, of the movie title. We're treated to one really big laugh right after the title card when the opening credit proudly declares Chridtopher Lee as Count Dracula, and we get a close-up of a mound of powdered blood. We jump forward a few years and to a different country, England, and we find ourselves on the outskirts of London, and we follow the lives of three English gentlemen, Hargood, Paxton and Seckler. All three of them present an upstanding charitable facade to the public and their family, but we soon discover their hypocrisy. They attend church on a Sunday morning and then focus on their charitable work every last Sunday of the month, and this involves a trip into the city, booze, drugs and brothels. But the problem is that they've grown tired of their sinful excesses and yearn for greater and more extreme experience. So step forward Lord Courtenay, a young, disgraced member of the aristocracy who is rumoured to have sold his soul to the devil. Courtenay promises them infinite experience, making him maybe a forerunner of Hellraiser's Frank, but only if they agree to forego their souls and also pony up some not inconsiderable cash to buy the Dracula artifacts that he himself cannot afford, which, after a little bit of dithering, they agree to do. They meet in the desanctified church-cum crypt of the Courtenay family, where the three of them discover that the title of the movie they're in is not some florid metaphor. They're each expected to drink a huge goblet full of the re-liquefied, reactivated, fetid blood of Dracula. The ceremony, designed to sell their souls to the devil and invoke Dracula, is a nice bookend to the ceremony that comes later on in the series, held by Johnny Alucard in the also magnificently titled Dracula AD 1972. Anthony Hines is again on script duties, and again his focus is a frustrated love story between a young man and woman. And again he takes about half the runtime of the movie to resurrect Dracula. This is where the Dracula franchise starts to seriously wobble, with Dracula feeling like a bit player in his own movie. Hammer didn't know if Lee would be back or not, and they hedged their bets with a script that didn't include his character, meaning he does feel a little bit crowbarred into proceedings. With Chridtopher Lee's increasing reluctance to reprise his role of the Count, Hammer intended to replace Lee and Dracula in the franchise with the Lord Courtenay character. Now, they've been dabbling with disciples of Dracula ever since the first sequel, Brides of Dracula, and have always, I guess, made Hail Mary attempts to get Chridtopher Lee back in. That was always the prime for them. They never really plunged fully into a Dracula-free, sort of wider, we'd call it now, a Dracula cinematic universe. Hammer's American distributor refused to release the film if it lacked the appearance of Dracula. According to Lee, Hammer managed to persuade him back into the role, not by paying him the decent salary he was asking for, but to essentially guilt him with the scenario that the cast and crew would be losing their jobs if he didn't agree to return. I am conflicted about this movie. It would probably have worked better as a sort of Brides of Dracula side film to the main Dracula franchise, a nice dark morality play where the sins of the fathers are visited upon them by their children. It's a strange proposition when you've got a great looking film, wonderfully acted, that brings the ugly subtext of previous movies into the light a lot more with a smart and consistent story, only to feel it's actually let down by having Dracula in it. It's a poor Dracula movie because Dracula pretty much does nothing in the film except count, whilst at the same time, on its own terms, it's a really fun, good, nasty little hammer horror movie. Once Dracula's back and Lord Courtney is summarily moved out of the way, nope, you're not taking the place of Dracula. Here's Chridtopher Lee, he's back. We haven't really written much for him to do because the script was already done, so what we're going to do is have him turn these three hypocrites, fine upstanding members of society, with their dark, sinful peccadillos hidden from view. We're going to weaponize their own children and turn them against them. So Dracula does sort of seduce the daughter and turn one of the other daughters into a killer. And once again, as with any Heinz Dracula script, there's a blonde that needs saving, there's a redhead who'll get turned into a vampire and killed, there's a frustrated love affair between the blonde and a young man, usually he's called Paul, which has to be resolved by the end of the movie. An awful lot of replaying, but the way it's replayed and retold in Taste the Blood of Dracula is really good fun. Where Dracula is on the margins of this movie, Jeffrey Keane is fantastic as William Hargood, probably the leader of the three gentlemen of means in the film. He truly is the villain of the movie. He bullies his wife, he beasts his daughter Alice. He is a truly despicable man. When Alice sneaks out to meet her young beau, Paul, who he forbade her to see, there's a portion in the film, there's a scene where he is waiting for her to return, waiting in her bedroom for her to return, drunk and enraged. It's a truly horrible scene that hints at a darkly incestuous impulse of his, where he tries to thrash her with a riding crop whilst drunkenly staring at her lasciviously. We do get this strange, really uncomfortable feeling that this confrontation between father and daughter has been building up probably since puberty hit and her figure began to fill out, when she began to grow from a young girl into a woman. When we first see him lash out at her for the crime of talking to Paul outside of the church, he pointedly and uncomfortably remarks to her that she shouldn't be engaging in this behaviour because she is now sexually mature. It's obviously something that's playing on his mind much more than hers, and the implications are horrible. He chases her out of the bedroom and out into the garden at night, so that when Dracula arrives on the scene, it's almost as a saviour. The scene builds and becomes more and more uncomfortable until Dracula arrives and puts an end to it by hypnotising her, or put it this way, he's always acted as a kind of activator of hidden desires and impulses in his victims. In Taste the Blood of Dracula, the conflict is clearly generational, and through Dracula's particular brand of corruption or release, he either compels or frees the children of these three hypocrites to wreak destruction upon their own parents. It's either something he makes them do or an impulse that was inside them that he just unlocks. Linda Hayden plays Alice, our blonde heroine, Alice Hargood. She is fantastic. At first, I'll be honest, she seemed a little insipid to me, a little bit too goody two-shoes. There was nothing much to her. But as with every previous paramour of the Count's, she gets the opportunity to show her bad side once she's got her drac on. So whereas before she was virginal and goody two-shoes and very, very vanilla, she later on gets to play some deliciously dark aspects of Alice. The sort of freeing joy of being bad. And I realised, oh no, Linda Hayden, she wasn't a poor choice, she was absolutely a fantastic choice. Later that same year, this actress gets to push that duality to even more extremes as Angel, the innocent looking but demonically possessed temptress in the gorgeous slice of English folk horror Blood on Satan's Claw. As I mentioned earlier, one of the other daughters is a redhead, and if we know anything about redheads in these Hammer Dracula movies, they don't fare well. They generally get vamped first and turned, and such is the case here. But whilst that's old ground we're retreading on, it develops into the absolutely fantastic showing of, Death by Vampire Daughter. It's a real standout scene where the second father, Paxton, comes across his daughter's corpse, now turned into a vampire, weeping over her body, unable to bring himself to use the stake before the sun goes down, and then she wakes up and the tables are turned and the stake is turned. It's not something you see much, and it's deliciously creepy and again deliciously nasty. Sometimes these Hammer vampire movies can bring the nasty in amongst all the other stuff that we've sort of been there, done it, bought the t-shirt. Chridtopher Lee was a last minute addition to the film. He barely has any dialogue, and most of it is him counting when his revenge, again it's a very personal revenge story for the Count, is brought down upon these three. He says ominously, the first, the second, the third. When he appears in Alice's garden for the first man to be taken down, though, he does arrive like a dark prince. And this film, if anything, it proves that Chridtopher Lee can be absolutely commanding just by simply standing still. He's given ludicrously little to do in this film, but that's the fault of the script, and that's because the script was written without his character in it. So I guess you have to ask, what are you going to do? Would you prefer this to be a slightly more rounded film without Chridtopher Lee in it, or are you happy to have Chridtopher Lee as Dracula in it, even though he's just on the fringes of this film? Every Hammer Dracula film has to have a splashy Dracula death at the end of the film, and this is probably the most head-scratching Dracula death that you'll come across in the entire franchise. Dracula makes his camp in this desanctified church of Lord Courtney's, and that's where he lures an awful lot of his victims, and that's where the face-off is at the end between Dracula, Alice on Dracula's side, and Paul, who has come to save Alice. Dracula kind of just dies. I don't really know how else to say it. There's a suggestion in some reviews that he dies because Paul has re-sanctified the church, and I guess perhaps maybe, I mean, he swapped out Courtney's black altar cloth for a white altar cloth, and he took out a couple of Lord Courtney's black candles and replaced them with white church candles and lit them. I mean, it's kind of hilarious that Dracula gets trapped in a church because he chooses to dump Alice. Poor Paul is there yelling at her, "You don't have to go with him, Alice, you've got a choice." And she does have a choice, and she chooses to go with Dracula, but Dracula basically just ghosts her and goes, "I've had enough of you, girl, I'm off." And she goes, "Well, fuck you then." And she takes a cross and she throws it in front of him, barring his exit from the church. And then the church sort of magically re-sanctifies and kills Dracula. It's absolutely bizarre, but poor old Paul walking off with his girlfriend at the end of the film has got to be thinking, she didn't exactly choose me, did she? She kind of chose to kill Dracula after he dumped her. Hell truly hath no fury like a woman spurned. I can really dig the notion that Dracula gets killed by a dumped woman. That's fucking delicious. Death by re-sanctified church, it's a chin stroker. In amongst this dark and twisted morality play, there are some really great shots, some nice, gorgeous camera work. One that really springs to mind is after Lord Courtney dies and his body is left sprawled out on the floor of his family church. We look at him from up on high, and then in the Dracula, it's the Dracula resurrection scene essentially. His heart starts beating again, and the camera closes in on him, but in time with the beating heart, boom, 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 getting closer and closer and closer until he becomes, or at least Dracula's spirit invades him and resurrects his body. It's all a bit loosey-goosey how Dracula kind of comes back, because he was never really supposed to come back. Also, at the end of the film, in the same church as Dracula's being sort of standing up in front of one of the windows, being overcome by the whatever, there's this wild swaying camera shot sort of showing Dracula's point of view, looking down from this top window inside the church, and it's really dizzy and vertiginous and really gives you a sense of Dracula's point of view, and you don't often get Dracula POV shots in these movies. I also really like there's an excellent shot where Paul is holding up a sort of a brass or a gold cross to Dracula, and it's just lit. So it's almost on fire, it's glowing, it's like a neon cross sort of vibrating with the power of this artifact, and you can kind of see, now I can kind of see why Dracula's repelled by this. And of course you've got the newly vamped girl at the window entreating her brother to let her in. This kind of shot is never not chilling, and so it is here. I'm an absolute sucker for vampires returning from the grave, dead family members returning from the grave as vampires, appearing at windows asking to be let in. The greatest example, clearly Tobe Hooper's Salem's Lot and the Glick brothers. In my opinion, one of, if not the scariest scene ever. So the vampire at the window scene here is not as scary as that, but it's still chilling. So Lee is great, but he's given nothing to do. As a Dracula film, Taste the Blood of Dracula fails, but, as a delicious slice of taboo-busting gothic, it is pretty fabulous. But if it hadn't been a Dracula film with Lee playing the Count in some form, it wouldn't have got the American funding it needed to have been made at all. There's a strangely schizophrenic what-if feeling to Taste the Blood of Dracula. What if Hammer had been able to stick to its guns and take the franchise into the realms of the next generation, following Dracula's disciples? After all, they did that with Brides of Dracula, and that film is superb. It's one of their best. But also, what if Hammer had been able to secure Lee much earlier on by not being a dick to him, affording them the time to fashion a new film around Dracula himself? Later sequels will suffer from this cinematic chicken and egg. Which came first? Lee dragging his heels and not really wanting to play Dracula, or Hammer not really having any idea of what to do with the character in the first place? Hammer found itself at a crossroads in the 1970s. Their particular brand of soundstage, day-for-night gothic was fast becoming old-fashioned and fusty. In Taste the Blood of Dracula, we see the seeds of which direction they chose to take in order to remain relevant. There's more gore. There's the beginnings of gratuitous female nudity towards the start of the film in the brothel scenes. There are boobs on show that really have no place there other than to titillate. Later, that kind of gore and nudity would become the very hook they'd hang their films on, but we'll get to those films in due time. Here, it's more like a seasoning, a sort of view of things to come, whilst the main central story of Taste the Blood of Dracula, all the performances, the look, the subtext, everything is absolutely on point. Bizarrely, except for Dracula himself.